in the School of Nursing and here in the Department of Pediatrics, where I spend about half of my time in the Division of General Pediatrics and Adolescent Health. And I'm here today to just orient you to a generous gift that allows today's lecture to be possible for Peds Grand Rounds, and also to introduce you to my friend and colleague and today's speaker. So I'd like to tell you a bit first about the Morris Blum Memorial Lecture. Morris Blum was born in 1912. Morris was orphaned at the age of 5 as a consequence of the Great Flu Pandemic of 1918. And then he was taken in by an aunt and uncle, completed high school, went to Long Island University, and subsequently to what now is the State University of New York at Buffalo, where he trained in dentistry. After serving the Army in World War II, he returned to New York to open an office in Queens and continued to practice dentistry in the same location until his retirement at the age of 77. Mo, as he was known, had 2 children, Nancy and Bob. And it was Bob, his son, who came to Minnesota as a pediatric resident in 1973. And remained on faculty here at the University of Minnesota and established our adolescent health program, and then became the chair of the Division of General Pediatrics and Adolescent Health. And Bob was our chair from 1978 and to 2004. I was one of many trainees and graduate students and residents and fellows that really our careers have been profoundly influenced by Bob Blum and his work. So Morris Blum, Bob's father, had numerous distinguishing characteristics, but first among them was his deep love for learning and a commitment to science and research. It was because of this commitment to science and research and moving that into practice that upon his death, his children, Bob and Nancy, and his extended family set up the Morris Blum Memorial Lecture to assure Minnesota will continue to have the opportunity to be enriched by the greatest minds in adolescent health. Speaking of great minds in adolescent health, I'm really excited to introduce to you today Dr. Megan Moreno, who, as you see by her slide, is a professor of pediatrics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Megan is also academic division chief of the Division of General Pediatrics and Adolescent Medicine, and vice chair of digital health for the Department of Peds at the University of Wisconsin, our neighboring state. Dr. Moreno leads the social media and adolescent health research team at UW-Madison. Through her work, she strives to help adolescents balance relationships, influences, and experiences that they have both in their online and offline worlds in our very highly technological society. And I see some of you checking your phones and your email by phone, so that's evidence in itself. Dr. Moreno's research also considers ways in which new technologies and social media may provide venues for education, support, and care of adolescents. Dr. Moreno is a member of the executive committee of the AAP Council on Communication and Media, and lead author of the AAP 2016 policy statement, Media Use in School-Aged Children and Adolescents. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Megan Moreno for today's Grand Round Lecture.
Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome, and I'm honored to be here to represent this lectureship. For today, I'm hoping that we're going to focus the time we have together to think about bullying, which is something that we in pediatrics encounter in our clinics and our communities. And bullying is such a vast topic, and so I'm hoping to focus on some newer information and some updates. So our focus today will be on these learning objectives First, to think about what is bullying, how is it currently defined? Second, to think about what are the effects of bullying on child health? What are some of the new data that are out there that help us understand the clinical implications of bullying? Third, what is being done to help prevent or intervene with bullying? And think about some results of a national consensus study that was released a couple years ago. What are some new research approaches for bullying? I'm excited to share a little bit about a study that we have ongoing. And then ending with thinking a little bit about the practical side. When we see patients in clinic, what can we as pediatricians do about bullying? And just thinking about our role and how critical it is in the larger scope of bullying. So first, let's start with what is bullying. Has anyone here ever seen a definition of bullying, like a real definition per se? Okay, so isn't that remarkable? We as pediatricians, most of us have never seen a definition of bullying. But if you think about it, most of our parents haven't and most of our patients have it. So how do they figure out if they've been bullied or not? It's a really tricky question, and it's a place where there's not a lot of consensus. Where there is some consensus is that the language of how we talk about bullying when we speak with our patients is changing and has changed. And one of the ways in which it's changed is the way that we refer to people who have been involved in bullying. And what that reflects is the idea that bullying now is really being considered a public health issue. So in the olden days, back when there were covered wagons and Ford Fiestas, people thought of bullying as kind of a rite of passage. It was something that you went through when you were a kid and you were probably tougher or stronger. And now it's really more as a major and preventable public health problem. And that really comes from some of the evidence I'll show you. And there's growing concerns, growing evidence about bullying having both short-term and long-term medical, clinical, physical health consequences. So when we think about these definitions, as I mentioned, what we used to say is there's a bully and there's a victim. And the way that the language in the scientific literature has moved away from that, kind of similar to how we all have moved away from the way that we refer to our patients. We wouldn't refer these days to a patient as saying, oh, that patient's a diabetic. We really have endeavored to say, there is a patient who has diabetes, so that the patient doesn't become the illness. And that's the reason for why some of this language has changed, to be able to recognize a kid who had a bullying experience as something more than that experience. Now, some of this may sound like nomenclature and like trying to be politically correct, but when you talk to youth who have had these experiences, it's very meaningful to them to not be told that they are a bully, to be told that they have been found to be a perpetrator of bullying or a target of bullying. These are really meaningful when you talk to the youth involved. So the current language is a perpetrator is a youth who has bullied someone. A target would refer to a youth who's been bullied. But the bummer of it is we haven't moved away from the language describing the third category, which is a youth who's experienced bullying and a youth has bullied someone else. And in the literature, you will still see that category referred to as the bully victim. That's a shame, but this is a category to pay attention to because these kids are the ones who are most at risk for short-term and long-term consequences. And we'll continue to think about that category as we talk today. So another shift in the way that we think about bullying is thinking about it as a dynamic system rather than thinking about it as a characteristic of a person or of a bully. Has anyone seen the cycle of bullying before, the Olweus cycle of bullying? Oh, good. So this is new as well. Excellent. So what this represents is the idea that this is a dynamic state and it can change, people's roles can change. So and this is actually kind of old. It's like from the 80s, and that's why you see the older language on it. So at the top, we have the person who's in the role of target or victim. Then we have the person who's in the role of bully or perpetrator. That person is often aided by some followers or henchmen who might actually jump in and help the bully out in certain circumstances. We've got supporters who maybe kind of jeer on or allow it to kind of build up and contribute to it. And then you have some of these supporters and passive supporters who watch but don't stop it. And then on the side of the target, you've got a defender. You might have a defender who's helping out the target or trying to stop the situation. You might have a passive defender who doesn't like the situation but isn't going to do anything. And then you have the disengaged onlookers. And what this circle shape represents is that these people can move in different directions depending on what the situation is. Now, another way to think about this is to think about ways or places that we all have seen this play out in stories, either stories we've seen in our own lives, stories we've read, or stories we've seen in pop culture. And a pretty famous one is Christmas Story. Anybody seen Christmas Story? Excellent. I know it's July, but we can go to Christmas Story. So in the middle, we've got Ralphie. Ralphie is our protagonist. Ralphie is also the target of bullying, as some of you may recall. So Ralphie, when he's going to and from school, he's very scared because there is a perpetrator out there who is giving him a hard time. The perpetrator, you might remember, is Scut Farkus. And I looked this up. It's actually S-C-U-T. Scut Farkus is the character. So how do you name a character Scut and not expect bad things to happen? I don't know. So we have Scut Farkus is our perpetrator, and Scut Farkus has a henchman who conveniently is even dressed like a henchman in this story. And these two work together to torment Ralphie and his friends. So on the other side, Ralphie, we've got his brother who's probably sort of a passive defender. He doesn't like it, but he is incapable of helping, probably because he can't get his arms down. And then we've got his two friends who also really don't like the situation and are mostly concerned with running away. Now, what's remarkable about this story is how it ends. And how it ends is that we see Ralphie transform from the target to the perpetrator, from the victim into the bully victim. And that's really interesting because this story is very famous, it's very well known, and there's lots of stories like it that tell the tale of the kid who's been bullied and the kid who finally fights back. And it gives you the sense that the fighting back has actually ended and resolved the situation. But what the literature shows us is that many kids, when they transform from target to perpetrator, will keep perpetrating and will start to perpetrate with other kids they perceive as weaker. So this is a somewhat unrealistic story, which is so surprising because the rest of the movie is so realistic. But I think it's interesting because I think this is a movie that sets a culture in a way that we think about bullying that is in contradiction to what the evidence suggests. But this is a way to think about those different roles and how they can shift depending on the situation. So what do we know about trends in students that are bullied over time? We know quite a bit from large national longitudinal studies. So what you see on this graph is 4 different studies. The orange is the school crime supplement of the National Crime Victimization Survey. The blue is YRBS, which many of you are probably familiar with. The red is the health behavior in school-aged children, and the green is the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence. The good news that you can tell from this graph is that between 1999 and 2013, in general, rates of reported bullying went down. What's a little interesting to note is that you have 4 different national surveys and they all report slightly different rates. So why is that? One of the reasons is because these big national surveys have really struggled with measurement issues. Each of these surveys asks about bullying in a slightly different way. So you can imagine if you're a kid and you're asked, have you ever been bullied? That's one question to ask and you might come up with one response. Another might be, has anyone done mean things to you? So if you're in the audience and you have never in your life had someone do mean things to you, I commend you. But that's a pretty tough question because most kids have had some sort of experience with someone doing something mean. And does anyone pick on you? That's another tough one. And one thing I've found is that's kind of an older type of framing. And I've had teenagers that are in middle school at that really concrete thinking, where they think that this question means, has someone come up and picked things off? So a framing and a measurement issue might come through in questions like that are using language that isn't easily understandable to all kids. So lots of measurement issues with bullying. And so one of the things that happened as a result is that at the national level, they put together a committee to come up with a definition of bullying. And I'll read it to you in a moment. But does anyone want to guess how long it took them as a group to come up with that definition. Yes. How long? 8 years. 8 years? Good guess. A little lower. Anybody else? Yeah? 5. A little lower. Took them 3 years. 3 years to come up with this incredible run-on sentence. And these were some of the best minds in the field, people who had dedicated their entire research careers to bullying. And this is what they came up with. Bullying is any unwanted, aggressive behavior by another youth or groups of youths who are not siblings or current dating partners that involves an observed or perceived power imbalance and is repeated multiple times or is highly likely to be repeated. That's an interesting hedge there. Bullying may inflict distress on the targeted youth, including physical, psychological, social, or educational harm. So this is called the CDC's uniform definition of bullying, to get at the idea that this is supposed to tie together and create this very concise and understandable definition of bullying. And this came out in 2011. They started work on it in 2008. One of the challenges that this definition faced is that right around the time it came out was when cyberbullying was really heating up as an issue. And there were a lot of questions about how this definition applied to cyberbullying. So the committee came back and said, cyberbullying is a context where bullying may occur. So bullying might happen on the playground, it might happen on the bus on the way to school, it might happen online. It's all the same thing. Yes? Well, they wanted this to a really good question. The question is, why does it say youth or youths? So what they wanted it to apply is the concept of peer bullying and peer victimization. So they were okay with the idea that the perpetrator might be one youth or multiple youth, but you can tell what they wanted to exclude was anything that would fall under the purview of dating violence, and for whatever reason, anything that would fall under the purview of something that was happening in the home. Yeah, your expression is very similar to many people's, and mine too. And one of the things that's interesting about cyberbullying is there's ways in which at the time people thought, I don't know, cyberbullying, I don't know if it's just another place where bullying happens. And so some studies started to look at this, and one study came out with the idea that, you know, bullying is really about power, and it's about a perpetrator having power over a target. But cyberbullying kind of flips that table because the target doesn't suddenly have more power. They just have a new tool where they can push back against that perpetrator. So being able to bully someone back online doesn't make you stronger. It just means you know how to use a new tool. And then another issue that people raised is bullying on social media or online, you can have a single event or a single post go viral. So how does that fit in the idea of repetition? Does it count? Does it not count? There's other issues within the definition around that cyberbullying occasionally is anonymous, though it's very rare for it to be anonymous. How does that fit into the definition? So there's challenges to this definition, but I think it's worth being aware of because it's the only really consensus-driven definition we have right now. So another thing that started to arise is looking at differences between cyberbullying and bullying in general. And this work started around 2011 to 2013, saying, are these the same thing and are they different? And one way that some people pointed out that they might be quite different is that the prevalence is pretty different. If you look at school-based bullying, you see a prevalence of 18 to 31%. If you look at cyberbullying, you see a prevalence of 7 to 15%. And so the thought was that cyberbullying was a very fringe behavior, that it probably just should be under the umbrella of bullying. But what's interesting is that many of these studies that report these findings often go from around 6th grade to around 12th grade. So you can imagine that in 6th grade, 8 years ago, there weren't a lot of middle schoolers who were probably engaged in cyberbullying. If you looked at that now, it might be different because we know that the average age that kids are getting a smartphone is 10, but that's newer. One other thing that's important to keep in mind is that for traditional bullying, it starts in elementary school, it peaks in middle school, and then it starts to dissipate in high school. Whereas for cyberbullying, we see it barely start in middle school, peaking in high school, and continuing through college. And some of the studies that we've done in college students say that up to around 20% of college students will say that they've experienced some sort of cyberbullying in college. So the peaks and the rises are a little bit different for these two phenomena. And if you look at national trends for cyberbullying, you see kind of in two of these studies, the growth of this issue up through around 2011, peaking there and starting to drop off. But then you have this outlier survey that starts way up there and comes back down. This is another area where there's been huge measurement issues, where again, there's been questions like, has someone done something mean to you online? And other questions that were incredibly narrow that say things like, have you ever been repeatedly harassed in chat rooms? Where today, many teens would say, okay, first of all, what's a chat room? So again, another place where there's measurement issues. But what we're seeing in the last 5 years in the growth of evidence is that there are some really critical places where bullying and cyberbullying overlap, and those are really important. One is that you see the same risk factors for the kids who experience bullying online and offline. We also see that the current trends in bullying are that kids who experience bullying are often experiencing it in both places. It's not that there's a group of kids that are cyberbullied and a group of kids that are bullied in offline life. It's the same group of kids, and they're getting hit in both places. And then we also have seen that as intervention studies have rolled out targeting specifically cyberbullying or targeting specifically school-based bullying, we're seeing spillover effects where the effects on bullying also translate to cyberbullying, suggesting that we can use some of the same mechanisms in our interventions to address both. So what does that mean? Well, this is a diagram suggesting where the data is starting to show us where bullying and cyberbullying, their relationship. So one thing I want to point out is when you look at perpetrators and targets, there's a Venn diagram there where some of the risk factors for perpetrators, things like a history of depression symptoms or anxiety or adverse childhood events, those are also characteristics that are common among targets. There are unique aspects, but there's definitely overlap in some of the risk factors for perpetrators and targets. And then when we look at characteristics of the bullying experience, so what are some of the words that kids use when they describe their experience, we see that bullying has some unique aspects, but there's a huge overlap with cyberbullying, but there is some unique pieces to the cyberbullying experience. So when I say characteristics, it gets at, in the bullying experience, you can have some of the characteristics being that it's physically painful. Maybe someone punched you or pushed you. That's something that isn't part of the cyberbullying experience. And in the cyberbullying experience, one characteristic might be that it's anonymous. That doesn't happen when a kid comes up to you on the playground. You usually know who it is. And then similarly for bullying techniques, the ways that perpetrators can inflict bullying, there are some unique pieces to traditional bullying, but there's a lot of overlap in cyberbullying. So things like trying to exclude you, trying to make your friends think that you're lame, a lot of those same techniques apply. And then just recognizing here that there's been a lot of cyberbullying cases that have been called out as very unique. And that's something that is a more recent phenomenon when you think about what you read in the news. There's a lot of news stories that describe in detail a case of cyberbullying, and that's not something we see as much in bullying anymore. And then it's important to recognize that a lot of the consequences, the health consequences, the emotional consequences, are very similar for both the perpetrators and targets. So let's think, what are some of those consequences for perpetrators and targets? What's some of the new data that we now know about the clinical effects of experiencing bullying? And a lot of this is pretty exciting because a lot of it comes out of lab-based models, functional MRI, animal-based models, really going to bench science to understand the clinical effects of bullying. Most of us who have seen these kids, we know that often they come to our office with a range of physical health concerns. So they might come in and be concerned about sleep disturbances or GI concerns or headaches. I would say in my clinical practice, I've had a handful of kids referred to me for bullying and hundreds of kids referred to me for these things, where when you dig deeper, it turns out that bullying is part of the clinical picture. But we also know now that bullying can affect changes in stress response systems, and those increases in stress response systems, that prolonged exposure to those stress-based hormones and stress-based conditions, those can lead to increased risk for mental health problems, for cognitive problems, and for emotional dysregulation. And so when we look further out, we see that there are now longitudinal studies that suggest that being bullied in adolescence has been linked to long-term risks for depression, anxiety, and alcohol and drug use in adulthood. And this is particularly salient for the bully victims. If you look at the data, it's the bully victims that have 5 or 10 times the risks of these long-term outcomes, even more than people who have just experienced being a perpetrator. So seeing kids who have had the experience of being both perpetrator and target, those are the kids to watch out for. I want to point out, as we've been talking about consequences, that what we've said so far is that bullying does have significant short and long-term psychological consequences. Individuals who are involved in bullying in any capacity are more likely to contemplate or attempt suicide. But this is very, very new as an area of work. And there is definitely, at this point, not enough evidence to conclude that bullying is a causal factor for youth suicides or a causal factor for school shootings. Data are unclear on this. So I just want to make clear that I'm not trying to make that leap. That, I think, is where the research is trying to solve this question. But again, individuals who bully others and are bullies are at the greatest risk. So how does this work? Well, there's been some literature now that looks at the experience of having a bullying experience as a youth as an adverse childhood event. So the evidence suggests both these social cognitive as well as emotion regulation processes may mediate that relationship between bullying and adverse mental health outcomes. So bullying can share this overlap with early abuse and trauma, and also shares with it this idea of the chronically activated stress system. But not every kid who experiences bullying is going to have those negative outcomes. And it's really important to think about the moderators, including the length of the experience. Having a bullying experience that lasts a month or 2 is very different than one that lasts 5 years. And then also what that child's support system is. And I think that's where the literature is also really exciting, because there's some studies that suggest that having just one adult in a kid's life who will listen to them and provide support, not necessarily solve the issue, but just be there for that kid and be willing to listen and tell them that situation sounds awful, I'm here for you to talk to you, that can totally change the trajectory of where that kid ends up, even if it doesn't solve the bullying. So one adult can provide that support and change that trajectory. There are some groups that are more vulnerable to bullying. Many of those you've probably heard about. And I think these are groups where we want to be more attentive to being sure that we're screening and providing support. This includes LGBTQ youth. This includes racial and ethnic minority youth. Sometimes we don't think about this, sometimes we do, but youth with disabilities are also shown to have higher rates of being the target of bullying. And also youth who are obese. This is a growing area. Bullying research is realizing that this is a group that is also more vulnerable to bullying. So let's think a little bit about some efforts to help prevent or intervene with bullying. And what I'd like to share a little bit about is some current national recommendations regarding bullying. And these recommendations come from this consensus study by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which is what encompasses what we used to call the Institute of Medicine. Now it's called National Academies. They put together a consensus study called Preventing Bullying Through Science, Policy, and Practice. They had about 15 people on the committee to put together the consensus study. I'm really excited. There were 3 of us who were pediatricians. So it was me, Fred Rivara, and Matt Masiello. So within that group, we as pediatricians were representing. And our charge was to review the literature, meaning all of the literature, and coming up with some consensus recommendations about where do we go with bullying. And the study was sponsored within the National Academies by the Board on Children, Youth, and Families in conjunction with the Committee on Law and Justice. And I think that's worth pointing out because, again, It represents that bullying really is something that we think about from the health perspective, but it also bumps up against the criminal justice and the legal system. And our goal was to try to produce a consensus study and report looking at the biological and psychosocial consequences of peer victimization, some of the risk and protective factors, and come up with some recommendations. So I briefly just want to mention two of the recommendations. This is the way that the National Academies frames their recommendations. There's who's supposed to do it, what you're supposed to do, and why. So this recommendation involves U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the U.S. Department of Education. The action is to support the development, implementation, and evaluation of evidence-informed bullying prevention training for individuals who work directly with children and adolescents. That's kind of sounds a little Fed translate. And the goal is to increase knowledge and awareness of bullying among those on the front lines. This recommendation is in direct response to the literature suggesting that one adult role model can make a difference for a kid who's experienced bullying. So what this recommendation is saying is they want to get better bullying prevention training, and they want to get it out to people who are local soccer coaches and in 4-H and in Girl Scouts, so that people are understanding some of these risk factors, understanding how to talk to kids who have experienced bullying, understanding how to be better advocates when they're on the front lines. This is sort of exciting to me because it means that we're really thinking about who are the people out in the community who are seeing this or who are already in a place to interact with those youth. So I think this is an exciting recommendation. And I think it also recognizes that the vast majority of bullying prevention research to date has all been focused on universal school-based programs. You go into a school, you do a series of sessions, the kids are learning, you give the same sessions whether the kids have been exposed to bullying or not. And what we see is that these programs are usually positive, but in a really small, modest way. And so what we're trying to move towards, what the statement is trying to move towards, is multi-component programs. Programs where maybe it's in the school, maybe there's some in the community, maybe there's some in the pediatrician office. And again, getting at the idea that these positive relationships with teachers, with parents, with peers, with adult role models, that's one of the strongest protective factors we have. One of the really important pieces of when we were doing the literature review for this consensus study is that one of the other pediatricians and myself, we offered to look in the literature for all of the pediatrician interventions and write a chapter on best practices for pediatric providers. Anyone want to guess how many there are of those? There's none. There was nothing to put in the chapter. There's no interventions out there that are housed in pediatric offices, driven by pediatricians. There's nothing. So I bring this up because I think it's an incredible opportunity, especially with this movement towards thinking about people other than teachers as being on the front lines, to have us think about what role we can play, what we can do in our offices. Another thing I love about this report is that they had non-recommended approaches. I love knowing what not to do. It's easier to remember than what to do. So these are approaches where there is a lot of evidence to suggest it doesn't work, and sometimes it makes it worse. So one is zero tolerance, automatic suspension or expulsion for bullying. Guess what that does? It lowers people's willingness to report. So when they put this into schools, initially they said, oh my gosh, this is fantastic, the prevalence went down. And then they went and talked to kids, and kids were like, we're just not telling you. So that's basically what zero tolerance does. Encouraging youth to fight back, like Ralphie, it doesn't work, and often it backfires because the retaliation is larger. Youth-facilitated programs, peer mediation, peer-led conflict resolution even when facilitated by adults, the data suggest it doesn't work. It's really a bummer because it sounds like a great idea, but something about the adolescent developmental period and the social context where bullying occurs, it doesn't work for kids. And then this is my favorite, one-day awareness-raising events or brief assemblies. They do not produce sustainable change. So if any of you guys get invited to go out in the community and give a talk in front of a whole high school, you can say no thank you because that's a non-recommended approach and there's no evidence to suggest it will help. So what are some of the new research approaches for bullying? I want to share a little bit about a study that we're doing right now with this idea of who in the community can be involved. What are some other people that we can involve in efforts to reduce bullying. And this study, like most of the studies that I do, came from one patient. So one day in clinic, I was seeing a patient, and I asked the patient whether or not they had ever experienced bullying. And the patient replied to me, well, I haven't killed myself yet, so probably not. And I asked her, it was a her, this is a guy who was willing to pose for this picture for me, to represent her expression. She said, you know, I've seen all these news stories, and my parents talk about these news stories about teens who have killed themselves because they were bullied, and I haven't done that. So it looks like I probably haven't been bullied, right? So I just thought that was such a poignant story to me, and I heard slightly watered down versions from a few other families, and even from a couple parents. When I would try to mediate between a teen and a parent to talk about the teen's bullying experience, the parents would be like, oh no, he's not depressed, it's probably not even bullying, it's fine. And it made me think a lot about what the impact is of news stories on perceptions of what bullying is. And so the study that we're doing and so I did some looking around into the news to see what kinds of stories were out there. And one of the things that I found is that there's a lot of stories out there about cyberbullying and suicide. You could probably get about 100,000 hits or more if you go into Google and put those terms together. And they're very poignant and very heartbreaking and very individual and personal, and sharing a lot of information and trying to make that leap of causality. And so if you're a parent, you know, and you're reading these stories, it makes sense that you might start to form an opinion of this is what happens. So the study that we're doing is understanding the impact of news coverage on youth and families. And the idea being that news organizations are influential in setting expectations about bullying. And we've seen this in other areas of health. There's been studies showing that news stories can either increase or decrease the stigma of mental health conditions. There's news stories showing that the impact of the way a journalist writes a story can change the way that people think about whether they're going to get their flu shot. And there's even been a study that suggests that parents trust news stories as much as they trust us as pediatricians. So parents often get their news this way, and it can affect the way they think about health. So in the case of bullying, there's a frequent use of these alarming headlines highlighting worst case scenarios. But at the same sense, this may offer an opportunity where news media may be an untapped resource to promote more prevention messages. And this is something that we saw a couple decades ago. There was a group that worked with some journalists, mostly in the UK, to talk with them about changing the way they reported about suicide. So when major suicides would happen, the previous approach was that news stories would highlight the victim and tell the story of the victim's life. And what they found was that that was associated with copycat suicides, because people would see that and say, wow, my life will be glorified. I will have a front page story. And it would kind of make it seem like it was worth it. And so journalists got together and reviewed the evidence and changed their practices so that when there was a suicide in the community, they would briefly mention it and then spend the bulk of their typeset on prevention approaches and things that you could do if you're worried about a kid in your community. Total game changer. And so that is also the basis of this, some of the previous literature we used to think about this type of study. It's been done before. Could we do it around bullying? So one of the things we are working on is evaluating the current state of news organization coverage of bullying via interviews with youth and parents. We're also doing a linguistic inquiry looking at actual news stories of bullying the past 5 years. And then what we'll be doing next is taking those findings and doing interviews with journalists to try to think about an intervention. So here's some previews of one thing that we found. So we did a pilot survey with parents and teens to get an idea of how much they really were looking at news media. Because one of the things that we heard is, oh, teens, they don't care about media. They don't care about news media. They're just so busy on Snapchat. But if you look here, actually, in terms of reading online newspapers, slightly over half of our teens, and in this pilot part of the study, they were 15 to 18, said that they read online news. Probably not that surprising. About 82% of these teens said that they read news on social media. So yes, they are on Snapchat and Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, but they're also getting news that way, and they're following those news stories to their source and engaging in news in a way that we might not have seen a few years ago. And when you look at how many of them are accessing news daily, just over half of the teens said they are accessing news daily. So I think that's a really important thing to recognize about youth and how engaged they are in the news today. Another thing I wanted to show you was from our text analysis. So this is doing linguistic inquiry on a bank of published news stories, looking at some differences in how cyberbullying and bullying stories are written. So what you can see here is the dictionaries in the linguistic processing picks up words that connotate affective processes. So if you attend to words that connotate anxiety and words that connotate anger, and some of the example terms are here. So anxiety would be worried or fearful. Anger would be hate, kill, or annoyed. And then you compare news stories about bullying to news stories about cyberbullying. You see that in these two categories, there's significant differences. So the cyberbullying stories, around 34% of them include words about anxiety, and about 85% of them contain words that connotate anger. And in comparison to news stories about traditional bullying, you see those words, but in much lower proportions. So we're detecting that there are some ways that journalists choose to represent cyberbullying stories that are very different to traditional bullying, and that may affect the way parents and teens feel empowered or disempowered to deal with those types of situations when they're in their own homes. So let's get to what we as pediatricians and pediatric providers can do about bullying. And I think here, just thinking about our critical role in being on the front lines, what we can do for prevention and intervention. And this is one of those slides that's really simple to read, but it's kind of hard to do in practice. It's like, you know, we know to be healthy, we need to eat right and exercise, and that makes a great slide, but it's pretty hard to do. So when we ask about bullying, what are some things we want to think about? One is just recognizing and remembering symptoms related to engagement in bullying behaviors. So increases in depression symptoms, increases in anxiety symptoms, showing signs of fear, showing withdrawal from social contacts, having those somatic symptoms that don't have an easy explanation. Although I do remember a story of one patient I saw, and I asked her when her stomach ache started, and she told me 11:02 on April 23rd, and that was a bullying experience. That was a big red flag for me, that was the moment she had been bullied. And so sometimes they are able to give you more precise answers, and often that means an event happened. So I think that one thing to think about is how we ask about bullying directly, but without labels or assumptions that our patient is the target. I think that's a big trick of it, is many of us were trained to ask about bullying, assuming our patient is the good guy. And sometimes they're in a different role, or they're in a mixed role, and giving them space to be able to talk about that. So some of the questions that I've heard from other pediatricians that I like are being pretty broad. What experiences have you had with bullying? In some cases, I've found some patients will talk about being a bystander and how traumatic it was for them to watch their friend be bullied. So I think it's one of those questions that invites them to share the level at which they're ready to share. Another one that I've started using is, have you had experiences that you've wondered if they counted as bullying? And I'm surprised at how often I get a no to this question and a yes to this question. You'll notice that I don't ask specifically about cyberbullying. I try to ask about bullying, and then I ask, was it online or offline? And another thing I heard from patients is they feel like the word cyberbullying is just played out at this point, and they don't understand what it means, and they don't know if what it counts. But to think about bullying in online and offline, I found for me to be kind of a helpful way to approach it. So if you get patients who say they've had these experiences, asking them what their role was. And then I like to ask, who can you talk to about that experience? Because a kid who says, oh, I've already talked to my school counselor, I've got a good friend who's helping me, that's a kid I'm a lot less worried about than a kid who says, I have nobody to talk to. And I think recognizing for us as pediatricians too, that this isn't something we're going to solve in one visit. This is getting the conversation started, and part of our goal is to find that kid their one adult that they can talk to. So thinking about how to help them strategize who else they want to share with. And just remembering that some kids are more vulnerable, and so paying particular attention to those kids. Again, connectedness to others is a significant buffer for developing adjustment problems and some of the long-term problems among youth who have been bullied. And then a couple resources. These are a couple that I've collected over time. So one is stopbullying.gov. This is a great resource for parents. It's a federally based website. It's created by the Federal Partners for Bullying Prevention, who is a group that draws across multiple federal agencies. They're a very committed group. This is their passion. It reads like a government website, super boring, so parents love it. Kids don't like it. For kids, there's two that I really like. One is called That's Not Cool. And That's Not Cool gets at the idea of being able to think through bullying situations and trying to add a little bit of humor, just enough to sort of frame it as, you will be okay, you will get through this. But they do some skits and some role plays that a lot of patients really like. And then this other one is called reachout.com. This originated in Australia. It's a huge warehouse of amazing tools for kids who are worried they might have been bullied, kids who are worried they might be depressed, kids who are worried they might be transgender. It's just this huge toolbox of resources, and they have a lot of online counselors that they can interact with. It's a really phenomenal site. The US-based one is a little weaker. And so sometimes I'll send my patients to the Australian one, same language, they just got to get the hang of the slang. So to end with just thinking again, to date, the field of bullying prevention and intervention has been driven by education researchers, psychology researchers, and providers. They are an awesome group, super smart, and have really pushed what we know. But at the same time, we just don't have the involvement of pediatricians to think about clinic prevention, clinic intervention. And we often are at the front lines of learning about bullying from our patients. Sometimes we are that one trusted adult that a youth chooses to share an experience with. So a few roles for us to consider would be, again, to ask, to listen, to provide resources. We are never going to be the ones that are going to solve the bullying. Our job is to give tools to youth and parents to help them get through that situation in the most healthy way possible. Thinking about in your clinic, what are going to be your universal approaches that you ask every kid? What are going to be your more targeted approaches when you're worried about kids? And what about those indicated ones when you've got a kid who's disclosed an event to you? Thinking about teaching our learners about bullying as a public health issue, keeping it in that public health and clinical framework, and keeping it very evidence-based with what we know about kids' health. Advocating for programs that are effective, and thinking about ways to add to the evidence. So we've gone through these learning objectives. We've thought a little bit about the complex and definition of bullying. We've talked about new evidence for the effects of bullying on child health. We've thought about what can be done to prevent or intervene with bullying at that national level. What are the current recommendations? We've thought about some new research approaches, thinking about bringing in other players like journalists to the game, and then thinking about our role as pediatricians in preventing bullying. I'll put up here to learn more about the committee report or access the report. You can get a PDF of it for free, but don't print it because it's a gazillion pages. That's the hashtags for the National Academy of Science for the bullying report. And then the bullying committee has also put on a new online tool that links to outside resources. So I'll keep those up there in case anyone wants to jot them down or Google them. I'll thank you very much for coming and for your attention, and I'm really happy to take any questions or clarifications. Yes.
And I just wanted to kind of ask a question that I know that my mother, who's been a teacher now for like over 35 years in special ed in high school, and that I have also had. As a third-year medical student, I was in a child check with a middle schooler who disclosed to me a failed suicide attempt because he felt bullied by his teachers and peers. And it was pretty much like a simultaneous moment where I felt powerless and he felt powerless because neither one of us could answer the question how to stop it. And I've always felt that, like, kind of telling them, like, well, this is another website that you can go to, or like trying to tell people that bullying is an issue is only kind of punting the problem in a way. And I was wondering, like, what your idea was, or any methods that we could share with our patients on how to empower them so that in the situation where they are being bullied, they feel like there is something that they personally can do to stop it, as opposed to allowing it to happen and then just talking about it afterwards.
That's a great point. I think your point gets at a couple murky things. One is adult on kid bullying, which is real and happens a lot. And during the course of writing this report, when we would do community forums, that was one of the biggest things we heard, is why isn't anyone talking about this? And it's often in the school setting. One of the things that I think about is, geez, it took us this long to get this far with peer-based bullying, and nobody's really looking at adult kid bullying, never mind adult on adult bullying. So we've got a long way to go. At the same time, that doesn't help when you're in that room with that kid. So a couple thoughts. One would be, I think one of the things that's hard for us as pediatricians is we're used to fixing things. And this is a situation that there's no way that we're going to fix on a first visit. And we're probably not going to be the long-term fixers. But that doesn't mean that we don't ask. Because what some kids will report is the process of talking through it with multiple adults helps them to get confident in talking about it. And it means that they're more likely to figure out, once they figure out the right person to talk about it, they're more likely to do that because they've already done a couple practice runs. A really lame metaphor would be when you go to a conference and you're going to present your work, you do multiple practice presentations, right? It's kind of like that in some ways. Another thing would be is there another trusted adult at that kid's school? Is there another place that they can go within that school to try to tell their story and figure out what more local school-based resources are? And then a last thought that I have is sometimes I think about this when I'm working with patients who have depression. So I'm not going to be able to fix their underlying depression, but I'm able to be there so they can come back if it's getting worse and we can add more support. And I can hopefully help give them support in the experience of living with and managing depression. And sometimes I think there's some analogies there to bullying. I'm not going to be the one who's going to fix it. I'm going to give different tools and resources. You can come back if it's getting worse. We'll strategize again. I can support you in your life outside of bullying and hopefully help frame it so that it's not everything you are. But it does give you a feeling as a provider of some helplessness. So I think I would also think about self-care after those really tough visits, and where do you go to kind of vent about them? So I think I've talked around your question in multiple ways without answering that. I should go into politics. Yes.
Thanks very much. This was terrific. I was thinking about a resource here in Minnesota, the Pacer Center on Bullying. Can you talk a little bit about what their work is meant to this field? They focus primarily on bullying in the context of disabilities in schools. They have a national center. Have you seen their work?
I've just recently I stumbled onto them as a new resource, so I don't know as much about them. Being that they're from here, can you share more?
So they started with curriculum in schools focused on youth with disabilities, and now have a center in Los Angeles as well, and just have curriculum and advice. I think the residents go to visit Pacer Center here and see some of their work. So I didn't know if you had any impressions of it being evidence-based and that such. But
yeah, my sense of it is that it's a much needed resource because it does focus on youth with disabilities, and I think that's a group that hasn't always had as much attention to the bullying aspect. So I have a limited understanding of them, but I think it is something that's growing and worth exploring. A couple other things that I've seen out there is there's a number of youth that are starting their own organizations and movements. I think those are areas where it's ripe to go and partner with those youth-based groups and think about providing some measures and getting some outcome data, because I also think those are places where youth are really at the front lines and experience in their experience and are going and trying to do things about this. And if we can get some good outcome measures and help support their work, that would be a really great role for us. There's a question in the back.
I know you kind of talked about, you had the slide up about different demographic groups that are at higher risk. I was wondering if there were, if there was any literature on like age groups or life, maybe more generally, just like life transition points that as pediatricians we should be more kind of in tune to maybe asking about bullying and alert when stuff like that happens.
That's a really great question. I think that middle school in general is kind of the peak of the mean girl, mean boy phenomenon. So middle school is an age where I feel like every kid, I'm just watching for those cues and making sure I'm checking in on that. Another interesting one, I think, is the transition to college, because I think being able to talk with a kid about, is there anything that happened during middle school or high school that you're carrying with you that you kind of want to get out and work through before you go to college? Because we know that kids who have had these experiences when they're younger are more at risk to have them continue to happen. So that's another transition where a kid might even be ready to say, this is who I was, I want to build a skill set, I want to understand what happened, I want to kind of be ready for these new challenges and my own independence in handling them. That's a really great question. I think we have one in front.
Do small groups help? For instance, sports, theater, choir, is there a way for schools to incorporate that more in junior high? Because I think in junior high there's not that kind of diversity of support.
So I think that within those groups, sports groups, activity groups, I think some of what the National Academies report got at is the idea that there can be bullying even within those groups, and that often it's a coach or the advisor that sets the culture and the tone of that group and how they're going to address it. And so the idea around National Academies is trying to have better training available for people within those groups, so that if there's early rumblings or they learn about something, they feel like they have the skills to address it and keep the culture and the social expectations of that group on track. Because that's what we hear about a lot in the small groups, is that kids are watching each other and trying to figure out what's okay to say and do, what's the culture of this group going to be, and if the culture gets derailed early, it's really hard for an adult to get that culture back on track. There's one more in the back, I think.
Have you or anybody else looked at kind of early intervention and talking with kids in preschool, kindergarten, first grade about bullying and what that means, and maybe they're more receptive to talking about it or preventing it at that age?
That's such a great question. So as an adolescent medicine physician, I consider myself a pediatric geriatrician. So I have not done any preschool studies, but there are groups out there that are exclusively focusing on preschool and looking to see whether bumping these social emotional learning types of curricula really can be a preventive factor for later bullying. And I believe that they've had some early successes. And as you can imagine, a lot of the preschool and very young based curriculum are around social emotional learning. How do you handle yourself when you're feeling dysregulated? So I think that is a really promising area of work. I think the other interesting thing to me is, what do we do with adults and workplace bullying? That's another area where there's a few people working on it, but it's another interesting one. But I think going younger is definitely a trend that we're seeing. And people are even developing neat things like board games and kind of more very developmentally appropriate type of games and interactions for youth to try to teach some of these skills. And I think that's really promising. All right. Well, thank you all very much for coming on a beautiful August day.
You have been disconnected from the meeting.